Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review the first season of Mr. Robot. Pretty nice that this was like a 10 episode reprieve to otherwise just like watch something different, kind of watch something that that I've kind of really been like every once in a while I just keep seeing like Mr. Robot pop up randomly somewhere. I'm like, you know what? I should finally start watching this show. So, if you guys didn't know, you can go on to Amazon if you have an if you have an Amazon Prime account. You can go and watch seemingly every season of Mr. Robot on Amazon. So yeah, finally I was able to just sit down and just go. You know what? I'm gonna watch this show because I was kind of hesitant because it seems to be of kind of a higher thinking kind of show. It's kind of one of those where it really goes into talking about like corporate takeovers and takeovers with using kind of viruses or worms or stuff like that. Kind of this show kind of showcases that reasonably. It's basically you have these hackers, these big anarchists that are very much trying to take these big corporations down, or ultimately you have these companies that are kind of commingled with other companies and this and that, and basically you find out like these big corporations could not give a rip about the little man, and you start to see that some people fall into the cracks and kind of eventually like Elliot's character is the person that is that, where he himself physically hasn't fallen through the cracks, but ultimately his father had. So going into this show, I was like, you know what? I don't know if I'm gonna like the show. And then all of a sudden, while going into this show, I started to really see and understand exactly where they were taking all their references from to to get me into understanding the show. Like, I had seen the Angelina Jolie movie Hackers, which ultimately they present in the show to tell you, hey, this is where we got our source material from. This is where we got the idea of the show is from the movie Hackers. I'm like, oh, I seen that movie. Like ultimately knowing that that people that usually have passwords has usually very small amount of passwords, which is normally one of them is usually like God or something like that, because a certain developer is basically their password is basically a grandiose like word or term or whatever for what they think of themselves. So knowing that and seeing that like, hey, this is where we were trying to create this show from is a movie like Hackers, I'm like, oh my god, yeah, this is awesome then. If like, because I remember the movie Hackers. Also, when going into Mr. Robot, recently it feels to me like Fight Club a lot of the times. Like, a lot of this feels like Fight Club, the Brad Pitt movie. And even to the point where the ending song of Fight Club is actually trickled into one of the episodes of this show, to where I'm like, okay, so, like, they're really going out of the way to tell us exactly where they're getting their beats from and where the reference material is coming from. Ultimately, there's also if you guys probably like the Netflix show you will probably like this show, because it kind of feels like that. Um, like to me, ultimately, when going into this, you have a character that ultimately is narrating to seemingly an invisible imaginary friend, which is all of us. And So ultimately, when going through this, it is kind of interesting to have us getting trickles here and there of hearing the narration of ultimately understanding the process of this character. I think the narration helps this story immensely. Because ultimately, if you weren't to not get this narration, you probably wouldn't understand what half of this show was about. But luckily, they had that narration dipped into there to help us understand the inner workings of this character. So, there is also one more movie that ultimately I would say that this kind of takes the ideas from, but I can't mention that or otherwise I will probably spoil it. So, more than likely, hopefully, when I get into spoilers, I will let people know exactly what movie that is. Uh, because, yeah, there's an entire reason for that. Because ultimately, if I say, oh, yeah, it's just like this movie, then ultimately people will just be like, oh, well, now I know exactly what the story is now. Like, I know exactly what's going on. Because ultimately, this movie kind of really helps us figure things out of what exactly is going on. So, going into this, have we have a character Elliot, which when going into this show, the main problem that Elliot has is that he is feeling so like uh, cripping, uh, cripplingly alone. He's feeling so like he's feeling so much like distant from everyone, even though he could probably be sharing a room with somebody. It feels like everyone around him is not really quite there to him, which I just find kind of bizarre. Because ultimately, when looking at this Elliot, he could quite possibly easily make friends. He could quite possibly easily make a girlfriend, and so on and so forth. But when looking at it, like there's at points in times where Elliot has this awkwardness, and ultimately he's kind of completely fine with living in this awkwardness, but a lot of other people are just kind of like, yeah, not me though. So going into this, it seems that I'm not quite understanding exactly where Elliot is saying that he's alone in the world, because when looking at it, it seems like there's a lot of people there for Elliot at a lot of times, even to the point of it being new people that are looking at this guy and seeing how valuable he is and how much they want to vie for his either business or affection, or otherwise just like, hey, I definitely want you on my side kind of thing, because I think there's a huge amount of potential there. There's a huge amount of like, if anyone has a problem, they always turn to Elliot, because he seems to be the guy that really understands things, and he seems to be the guy that always has the answer. Recently, within this show goes into very much a butterfly effect of kind of like 7 degrees of Elliot. Basically, if Elliot shares a scene with anyone, basically the person that he shares the scene with, if that person has some friend, then more than likely Elliot will be sharing a scene with them as well. There's some kind of like butterfly effect or weird bizarre connection where Elliot is kind of tied to every single person seemingly in the cast, whether or not that they are a relevant character or not. It just seems like that's where the story just ends up going. So we have it to where Elliot is a very self-destructive like person, to the point of him having this crippling loneliness, but he ultimately is, I believe, too smart for his own good, to the point where he has to eventually seek therapy. He has to ultimately take medications, but then he also has to uh, come upon other means and things to work through his issues, his problems, and I'll go into that in spoilers. So Elliot basically hacks through everything. Basically, Elliot is this person that if he meets somebody, he immediately needs to know everything about them, and I mean everything. And it's really just kind of interesting within me to watch this person prattle off every single thing about someone's life without them having to physically tell them themselves. No, Elliot is basically saying, "Yeah, uh this is Christina, my therapist, and like I know every single thing about her implicitly before I even had a session one with her. Like I basically knew what her social security number was. I knew um like I knew some of her friends' names. I knew some uh I knew like intimate things that only her and supposedly some friend share on certain social medias, this and that. It goes off, and it's so implicit and it's so interesting, and it gets to the point to where it seems that Elliot is trying to do right, but he's doing it in a very God, that is like some weird Ashley stuff. Like we the thing that I found out when going into the pilot, and how they basically within this first opening of this show, they kind of let you know exactly how this show is going to break down, where Elliot kind of feels like the morality police, and so ultimately he simply takes it upon himself to hack into everyone, and then he basically is morality police. And so yeah, it kind of makes for a very interesting story, and so I ultimately like that. Funny enough, it seems bizarrely that Elliot is always looking over his shoulder, and that makes for a very interesting piece, to where when going into this, it seems like at some point Elliot is going to be just going about his regular day, and someone is going to jump him, or somebody's going to grab him and pull him into some car to be forced to do something he doesn't want to do. But that seems to be like his entire life. Mistakes had been made. So, going into this, I thought that this show, to me, at some points, was like a really interesting show. It was really fascinating to eventually peel back the layers of this show. But then there was also some kind of stuff where I was just kind of like, okay, I don't quite maybe understand a lot of this, but when looking at it, I'm like, well, maybe much more multiple viewings of this season maybe would get me to understand some things more, or break it down a little bit more easier, or try to understand what's all going on, or because I think this probably takes multiple viewings to grasp some things. So anyways, high intelligent like show, but then again, it's also kind of blatantly kind of doing some copying and pasting a little bit, because or not exactly copy. It kind of feels like a lot of things all melded into one. So let's get into spoilers about season one, because reasonably, yeah, the show to me like was fun enough, but then again, some people might also have a negative side of that it's too slow, or that ultimately it doesn't, like, they just don't quite they just can't quite get into it, or like we have Elliot that when it seems like things aren't going well for him, like people point out the blatant obvious where he's like, where they would mention like Elliot, it's like, dude, he's complaining about being alone, but he has so many people that are willing to just drop at the bat of a hat to go and see him. So it's like, hey, I hate that about this character, where it's just like he has to feel so like, is he alone in the way of him just being smarter than everybody? Is that the whole thing? Does he need an equal? Or does he just need a person that is just going to share a bed with him, that he actually does like, but he will never let anybody get close enough to that point? I don't know. So let's go into spoilers about this show. Let's ultimately dust out that double five. Hopefully no one dislikes this review just because maybe I'm not going to go into too heavy details, or ultimately I didn't mention enough, or this and that, or maybe I suggested that I thought like, I feel like this is a positive review. I don't think I'm very much trying to showcase this show in a negative light. So ultimately, if somebody goes into this show and then hates it because I saw it and then I mentioned it here, I do apologize. But I don't know. I was rather very much like happy after kind of watching a bulk of this show, but like also, like once we get towards like the longer that this season goes, it honestly does tend to drag a little bit as well. So there's I would say a lot of this is mostly positive, but every once in a while you sneak in some negative things. But overall, I liked this show. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time I'm gonna do spoil this show. So in the very beginning of this show, which kind of sets this show up perfectly, we have Elliot talking to the owner of some establishment. And ultimately, Elliot mentions that he's like, you know what? I love coming here because it has great Wi Fi. And I was really heavily curious, like why you have such good Wi Fi here. And then all of a sudden, he realizes that there is some underground, like adult content, like internet thing going on here, and that is kind of being bought and sold and this and that. And so ultimately, we have Elliot that is basically going to this man and basically mentioning, like, hey, since I figured this out because I hacked you, I want you to, I want you to, like you should probably do something. Like at first, the owner says that he's like, well, like, what do you want, money? Are you gonna blackmail me? It's like, if anything, like I'll give you money now and then you'll keep asking for it for the rest of my life. So that's a no. And so ultimately, like, this owner is just going like, well, like, you're not going to blackmail me, and I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. And so Elliot's like, well, okay. It's like, well, reasonably I don't care about money. And also, like, I've already like reported you to the police. If anything, I was gonna kind of give you like some kind of heads up beforehand, but yeah, I already called the police on you, knowing full well that you're not gonna be a person that is gonna give up or give in or ultimately uh just stop doing what he's doing. So, because ultimately, Elliot hacks everybody. And it's really interesting because we have Elliot who hacks his own therapist, um, Krista, and basically knows everything about her to the point of knowing that her boyfriend is cheating on her, and that ultimately he is eventually like hacking this guy's phone to get his information to just find out all kinds of stuff upon him. And it's also interesting when Elliot is with Angela that ultimately Elliot and Angela seem like really good old friends. Like basically they are sharing a movie together and smoking some weed, and like they're really just good friends that ultimately like Angela always comes to Elliot for every single like problem that she has with work. Cuz ultimately they are tied into some company that deals with like antivirus like things and stuff like that. So they got to figure out how to crack these viruses and stuff like that. It seems that they are they had been bought out by some bigger company who ultimately is owned by this guy named Terry Colby, I believe, or Colby. And so ultimately, we find out that this bigger company is kind of under fire about kind of being involved in this whole hacking thing. And so reasonably it ends up to where uh, Elliot is eventually going to be offered a job from Colby's company to work for them, because it seems like they are just going to snuff out the company that he works with and just kind of like keep him on the payroll, because out of everyone, this kid seems to be the smartest out of everyone. So, and Angela doesn't like that, so Angela is gonna try to like try to get Terry Colby to release his secrets, and Terry eventually like comes and tells her, it's like, there's no way I'm gonna like tell you anything. It's like, if anything, like you're gonna really have to like figure out a way that just blows my mind to the point of me wanting to absolutely look at you and ultimately do anything that you'll say. But anyways, Elliot eventually gets to the point of realizing that there seems to be some anarchist group called F Society that seems to be like hacking companies and trying to very much uh, kind of get through certain information to very much destroy certain kind of companies and this and that. And so because F Society's main game plan is to take take every single information of transitions of monies that are done through the internets or through any kind of like basically showcasing everybody. It's like, oh, you have this amount of money in the bank via numbers, but realistically, they basically want to, in Fight Club like terms, take uh, credit down to zero, to where ultimately nobody knows what kind of credit they do have, whether it's good credit, bad credit, whatever, or what they have in the bank or anything, because all of this information will all be wiped, and taking everybody down to just not knowing whose debt is for what and this and that. So we eventually have this F society that is hacking into this company that Elliot is in, and Angela calls Elliot to save the day. Elliot comes in there and basically is figuring out this hack, but F Society is basically letting him know full well that they knew that he was going to come in there and solve this whole thing. So basically, they're like winking at him, just going like, "Hey, like we know you're going to be the guy that's going to come in here. So like, hey, how about this? How about like you and me have a little rapport going on, to where ultimately like we can continue to talk to one another, because I think that like we want to try to get you on our side to do what you've always wanted to do." So Elliot is looking at this little like friendly like wink kind of thing going on, and he's like, "You know what? Like I ultimately could just get rid of this thing, but you know what? I'm kind of interested." So he kind of like tapers off this computer for him to ultimately get to see that he's like, you know what, like I want to see what F Society has to offer me. So we are consistently seeing the paranoia of Elliot. We're having a threat to think that always there's going to be a man over his shoulder. It seems like there's plenty enough times where it seems like once we start to see Christian Slater in here consistently popping up in the background somewhere, we ultimately assume that Elliot is being followed by Christian Slater, and who is ultimately Mr. Robot. To where the point of eventually, when Elliot is just kind of sitting near some bench, Mr. Robot is kind of next to him. Christian Slater is adjacent to him, just starting a conversation. And it's like, oh, okay, this is finally where Elliot is probably thinking, oh my god, this guy's a cop. I'm gonna get booked. I'm gonna go to jail. I'm gonna go to this and that. But Mr. Roboto asks him, um, it's like, well, hey, like, you kept the thing up on your screen, right? Um, you kept us on your computer. Like, you didn't take it down because we knew full well you could. And Elliot is like, oh my god, what? Like, you're these people, you're F Society? And Christian Slater's like, you know what? We can't talk about that right now. We gotta know when the coast is clear. But Elliot is still like pinging on it. He's like, well, no, I need to like, who are you? Like what? Like, why should I trust you? So we have a tour ultimately. Mr. Robot is asking Elliot to, like, ultimately we have it to where Mr. Robot is telling uh, Elliot a story about his background, kind of having a story about his father, And then eventually, when Mr. Robot doesn't know if he can trust Elliot, he forcibly has him do the same in kind. So we have it to where Mr. Robot tells Elliot a story about his father and this and that, and then eventually they get together and go to the headquarters of where Mr. Robot does all of his work. So, reasonably within this story, we eventually have Elliot that needs to decide if he wants to be with S Society or not, or just keep doing his regular job. And either way, Elliot would still have to work with his old job, but like he would also be working with S Society as well. It seems like in the very early ons we have Elliot's boss who is wanting to show a lot of interest in Elliot and kind of very much talk about that he is gay and kind of like just talk about his life to seemingly his coworker, because ultimately he's like, you know what, I think I can actually trust you and I think I can actually tell you everything. I believe this character name is Gideon, but I could be wrong about that. But yeah, so we have it to where his boss is just kind of being very candid with Elliot, because it seems like Elliot can be trusted. It doesn't really seem like Elliot is maliciously trying to, like, it doesn't seem like he's trying to catapult himself via this job to get somewhere bigger, or it doesn't seem like, it just seems that he's a person that it's like, oh, okay, well, like all the people that I'm working with, they're all really close friends to me, even though really, for Angela's boyfriend, in the end, it seems like there is some weird awkwardness between Angela's boyfriend and, of course, Elliot. And Angela's boyfriend confronts Elliot with, like, you know what, it is kind of awkward between us. And Elliot's just like, well, I don't really care about that. Like, if anything, I'm more than happily willing to live in this awkward, like, state together. But Angela's boyfriend isn't like that. So, going into this, we have it to where we find out little things about Elliot through his therapy sessions, kind of how his day is. But it seems that Elliot is really just lying to his therapist that ultimately he's taking medication that he really isn't. Ultimately, we very much more find out that here is the thing. This show eventually gets to be some point like The Beautiful Mind. And so ultimately we have Elliot, and that's the spoiler thing. I want to throw that out there, because now if people were to have watched this show, they would understand, oh, okay, I remember the Russell Crowe movie, and so I know where this is heading. If this feels like a spoiler to somebody, I already mentioned that it is spoiler time already. So, and plus me randomly saying that, I just wanted to say that just to get that over with, so that way eventually I don't completely forget it. That it's kind of like that movie. So we have Elliot that is very smart, but eventually is having crippling loneliness to the point of him taking drugs, taking morphine, taking any kind of high end like drugs, to just take himself out of the world, to, I guess, shut his brain off, probably. Because his brain is consistently rattling. All the while, eventually, his female drug dealer, it seems that they themselves kind of like commingle with one another to the point where it's almost like a boyfriend girlfriend like situation, but Elliot doesn't want to really seem and have it forcibly be that way. To where ultimately, when Angela comes in and is like, "Hey, how about we watch a movie together and smoke weed?" Elliot completely and utterly forgets that his drug dealer is still in his bed, and so Angela stumbles in on that fact, and he's like, "Oh," and she's like, "Oh, well, like that's great that you like found somebody, and that you've kind of just moved on." And Elliot's like, "No, that's not what this is," and so basically, it seemed like man, Elliot, you blew it. Like, dude, you blew it. Like, reasonably, like I think Angela was eventually more and more just like pining away for you and thinking like that you're holding a torch for her, and when ultimately she's looking at another girl in your bed, she's like, "Oh, I guess well you aren't holding a torch for me." So then like F it, I'm not going to care about men at all, or I'm not going to just care about anybody but myself. Because reasonably, Angela goes through this interesting journey, but I'm going to get to that in a second. So we ultimately have Elliot who sleeps with his drug dealer, but his drug dealer eventually has a boyfriend who seems to be like this thug Ash like character that once he lands in jail, this thug character ends up calling up Elliot to figure out a way to get him out of jail, which this whole sequence is very interesting, but I will get to that later. I want to get to Angela now. Now that I set up Angela, I'm going to really set her up now. And then we'll get back to the whole prison-ish like thing going on back to Elliot. So eventually we get to the point to where Angela is reasonably like it seems like she's having a really good relationship with this boy, seemingly at first, one of her co-workers. But then all of a sudden, like slowly but surely, it seems that this relationship is eventually going to fizzle out. Angela is going to eventually find out that her boyfriend is cheating on her because evidently someone had somebody, which I'm sure is probably Elliot, because recently what ends up happening is that Elliot eventually hacks this guy's phone and kind of gives Angela some photos of other women that, of course, her boyfriend has been with, and ultimately, like, kind of releasing to the fact of, like, yeah, this guy is either heavily cheating and having photos of other women in his phone. Yeah, so this guy shouldn't be trusted, and that kind of quickly fizzles out the relationship. The the boyfriend is trying to desperately like go like okay, like I'll tell you the truth now, and but I'm hoping that we can work this out. Angela is like still with this guy because ultimately she feels like she has no one else, and ultimately the boyfriend is trying to make it up to her. He's saying like, you know what, I'm in the doghouse now, but I'm going to try to work my way back into you falling back in love with me. But it seems like eventually Angela finds a girl that is kind of convincing her. It's like, you know what, like as this girl like basically kisses Angela and basically tells her, it's like, you know what, the only person that you need to be concerned about is yourself. Like basically you need to push all these people away, all of your friends, all the people that you think is gonna like be good for you, and you need to be good for yourself. And so then Angela eventually dumps her boyfriend and basically distance herself from he she basically distances herself from Elliot, because ultimately it's starting to seem that Elliot is much more and more lying to her. And so eventually she goes into very much wanting to work over like Terry Colby and like breaking him down to having him release some kind of information, which Terry won't do at first, but eventually like Angela just outsmarts him and outworks him, and then eventually he is just like, well, you know what, like, you know what, girl, like, good on you. It's like, if anything, I just thought you were like a nothing girl, but you know what, it just seems like, I guess, like a checkmate, I guess. So we have it to where we have this other character that I believe is Tyrell. That seems to be this corporate Ash like person that is slowly but surely losing his stuff. Like he's losing his SI or SHIT. And so recently this character is very much firing some of his co-workers. He is going into one of his like he's having dinner with his boss's like with his boss and his wife's boss, and basically this guy walks in on purpose with his boss's wife going to the bathroom and watches her go to the bathroom, and like he's doing every single thing to make either people uncomfortable, or ultimately he is just pushing people's buttons to see what happens, because he just does not care, because he just like is really starting to feel and see how wonderful things are, about how he's just kind of going and just doing these things because he's just like, I just don't care. All the while, this corporate-ish like guy is offering Elliot a job, which Elliot is absolutely having no disinterest in having, and ultimately just like it seems that this guy is very much connecting the dots on Elliot, because it seems like every single time there is some kind of problem, Elliot is bizarrely connected. So that is all going on. So Elliot eventually does tie himself on to Mr. Robot. The only thing is that eventually Elliot has to get the drugs out of his system. So, like the very early ons in of this show is reasonably that Elliot is trying to get clean, but he's taking a while to be able to do that. So basically, Elliot is trying to clean the drugs out of his system, and Christian Slater the entire time is sitting bedside with him to work this out. And everybody else is kind of around him are just like, dude, like I'm not gonna babysit this guy. Like if anything, we have a job to do. We have like stuff that we have like, and it's obvious that this guy, like they realize that like, dude, it's obvious that this guy is tweaking. Like it's obvious that this guy is on drugs, and so I don't want to work with this guy. So that pushes Elliot even more to get clean, so that way the people that he works with will trust him. So eventually we have a whole entire dream sequence of Elliot going into like this bizarrish dream sequence in one episode, and then eventually he wakes up to think that no one, like everybody bailed on him, but Christian Slater is still there going, no man, like I'm going to be at your side for you to clean your act up. Because eventually we have it to where Elliot is almost going to turn in the F Society, but he ends up because ultimately the F Society is asking for information that Elliot is not going to give them, and because he is not 100% sure about F Society, and so he basically is gonna go and turn. He goes to his company and is like, you know what? I think I figured out like this F Society people, and I think I can um, try and take them down. But instead, like it ends up that like basically when Elliot goes and tries to find them again, they completely vanish and disappear. So eventually Elliot is just still desperately thinking, you know what? I still want to be with this F Society. I think it's the right thing to do. And then so eventually Christian Slater ends up finding him again and then going, it's like, well, yeah, like we'll take you in, but this time around, like you need to earn my trust. And so Mr. Robot tells Elliot to tell him a story about his father. So Elliot tells us that his father was a guy that uh, had gotten the illness, had gotten cancer because of the company that he had worked with for a long time had made him sick. And so reasonably his health had gotten so bad that Elliot's father had told him to keep it a secret from everybody. But eventually when Elliot's father's health got so bad, Elliot told his mother, and because Elliot's father felt betrayed, he threw him through a window and broke his arm via the fall. And so eventually, Christian Slater's character ultimately kind of goes, it's like, well, yeah, because you betrayed his trust, and ultimately he like throws him to the ground or whatever. So eventually we get to the point to where now we are at this prison scene where kind of a weird bizarre transition, I know, a lot of stuff going on, and then okay, now to the prison. So we have Elliot that eventually seems to have people that eventually are going to be under the gun if Elliot doesn't work with this guy to get him released from prison. And so ultimately, Elliot needs to figure out how to like get this one guy unleashed from prison, but then without him like coming back to get to him. So ultimately, he has to do a whole entire prison escape for the entire prison to eventually get this one guy out, but then not have it lead back to him. So we have it to where ultimately the thugs that Elliot is working with to help this guy get out of prison, ultimately they are kind of convinced, is like, you know what I think I want to do? I think I actually want to kill him when he gets out of prison, because this guy has too many connections. This guy is just like, he's too spooky. He's too scary. I think like if he gets out of prison, we're gonna have to gun him down and then take care of him. The only problem is that when uh, is Elliot eventually tries to outsmart this guy that is otherwise trying to escape from prison, and so Elliot goes and like gets every single bit of information from this guy's company that ultimately he's holding this under him to ultimately just say like, well, I have every little bit of information on your company that you're going to do after you escape from prison. So if ultimately you're going to come after me or try to kill any one number of my friends, then like I'm gonna come after you and take all of your business, and so leaving you with nothing. So ultimately, we have it to where the guy breaks out of prison and ultimately kills the one, um, the one partner that was threatening to kill him, because ultimately they found out about him. So this guy eventually gets out of prison and goes about his way, and there's not much kind of backpedaling of that. So eventually, we get to have it to where going through all this, eventually we have it to be that eventually Elliot uh, and Darlene are having a moment together, and so Darlene, like to me, like is kind of like this intermittent character that ultimately is trying to take care of Elliot and trying to be his friend, and ultimately is coming to Angela at some points to try and be like this third wheel that is going to help Elliot out, but Angela wants nothing to do with him anymore. So Darlene eventually goes to Elliot and tries to like talk him in and helping him and this and that, and eventually Elliot kisses Darlene, and Darlene is like, "Oh my God, why did you kiss me? Like, oh my God, you must not even realize who I even am to you." And Elliot goes, "What do you mean?" And so eventually Elliot realizes that Darlene is his sister. He's like, "Oh my God, like all the memories are flooding back to me." And now I realize that Darlene is my sister, but then also he starts to realize like you know what? Like why is Christian Slater's character just being called Mr. Robot? And it's kind of interesting to see the numerous times that they kind of do these like promo things where ultimately uh Christian Slater's character is supposedly doing all these speeches and stuff. He's doing these F Society speeches and uh, telling people like to kind of gear up for things, kind of to where we're gearing up towards the end of this season. And so ultimately, Elliot is kind of very much trying to remember Darlene via like trying to bring up every single memory that he has of her, trying to realize that, oh my God, like, how is it that I have completely forgot about this person? But then eventually he goes home and starts looking through old photos and realizes, like, oh my God, Mr. Robot is Elliot's father. And Elliot is now, like, his mind is going like a million miles a minute. And so ultimately, bizarrely, at the perfect time, which is kind of weird, Mr. Robot comes knocking at Elliot's door saying, "Hey, we need to talk." And I'm like, okay, this is like too much of a coincidence or too much of convenient timing, and it kind of ruffles my feathers a little bit. So we have it to where I'm gonna have to pause here for a second because I'm like ultimately what had happened was like I had finished this review, but then ultimately I had accidentally deleted half of the review. So ultimately I have to go back in here and see like what all I covered, and then like make sure that I'm not leaving anything off heavily. So let's pause here for a second. All right, I think I kind of quite figured out everything. I think I kind of got through most of the bigger parts or most of the smaller parts. So let's go into the big part. So we have it to where Elliot is talking to Mr. Robot, and reasonably we have it to where Elliot is talking to Mr. Robot and kind of very much angry at him because it's like, dude, you couldn't have told me that you were my father. You couldn't have I told you like things about you to your face. and ultimately Mr. Robot is like, yeah, that's completely fine. It's like, that's okay. Like, I didn't realize like how far down the rabbit hole you had really gone to where you didn't recognize me, and then also you didn't even recognize your own sister. Like, I didn't realize how far down the rabbit hole you really were until till now. So we have it to where Mr. Robot is consistently going and coming and being a part of Elliot's life, and to where the point to where Elliot doesn't know what anything is real, even to the point of grabbing us, the supposed viewer, and saying like, did you know? Like, did you know this was going on? Like, basically, there's absolutely no trust going on here, to the point where he's not even trusting us, the person that is just the casual viewer, which I thought was kind of interesting. So, or I thought was kind of fun. So, we have it to where Darlene is going to now go with Angela to confront Elliot that basically this guy is not taking his medication, this guy is off his rocker, and all the while Elliot is talking to his father, who he now finds out is his father, and we have a whole flashback of the backstory of Elliot mentioning how, like, we found out that Christian Slater, Mr. Robot's character, was his father was a thief, and ultimately there was a whole flashback of Elliot stealing a $20 bill from some customer, and the customer confronts Elliot's father about it, and this robot never gets the $20 to this guy, but justifiably, Mr. Robot confronts Elliot and ultimately says, like, okay, you have the $20, right? And then ultimately Elliot gives him the $20, and then ultimately Mr. Robot's like, well, how about we go to the movies? There's a whole flashback about that. So Mr. Robot and Elliot are talking together in this graveyard, and so Darlene and Elliot confront Mr. Robot at this graveyard, and so what ends up happening is Elliot is telling Darlene that their father is there, that he was just talking to his father, and ultimately then he realizes that his father is completely gone, that his father is completely vanished. So we now realize that this is a beautiful mind-like situation where ultimately Elliot is going so crazy and off the rails to where he ultimately thought that F Society was just some separate thing. Probably isn't like that at all. That reasonably he has been with F Society for I don't know how long and he doesn't even realize it. And that ultimately he has probably been doing the work of Mr. Robot, not even realizing it, because he is sharing two lives. So we have Elliot just kind of scatterbrained and not even realize, like, he is so off the rails, it's ridiculous. And we have to where Angela is going off to kind of very much go and confront the Kobe Ashlight company, the Kobe Ash guy that has the company, and having a very much checkmate like scenario, because what ends up happening is Elliot and the F Society ends up releasing a unbeatable virus against this company that he works for, that Elliot works for, and it gets to the point where it knocks credit down to zero, to where absolutely nobody in the world right now has money, because ultimately there's no information that says anybody has any money anywhere. And so reasonably, like, Elliot is getting a taxi cab, but he can't pay for it because he doesn't have any credit anywhere. So, because we have a tour later, when Angela is watching some guy do an interview where he eventually confesses that this virus, like, people working round the clock to eventually try to beat this thing, but then ultimately he confesses that this virus is unbeatable, that it seems that we've lost. And so basically this guy just ends up eating a bullet, and eventually Angela gets blood on her shoes, and so there ends up being some corporate executive kind of talking about what's going on, and then he throws her a couple $100 bills to get new shoes. So we end up having eventually our Angela confronting Colby about this whole company situation and getting to a checkmate like maneuver, to ultimately pushing her to even more confront this guy. But Elliot is realizing how successful this thing has gone on. Basically, he's watching it through his job, and all while everyone is crazily watching some videos that the F Society is putting out. Elliot is just kind of watching the progress of this virus and not really stopping it at all. He's basically just letting it run, because ultimately he's like I should probably be the one deterrent thing, but I'm not going to deter this from anything. I'm just going to let it all happen, and no one can stop this now. So even to where the point of Elliot's boss confronts him, of just like being like, you know what, like, we were all in the office all crazily watching this meeting, or watching these videos that F Society was posting. You were back here just kind of just staring at your computer. Like, why? What are you doing? Like why aren't you like concerned about this F Society thing? It feels like you like either knew something, or like you just didn't care. And Ella's just like, you know, I'm just doing my job. Like, I'm looking at my computer. Who cares? Like, I'm just doing my job. So, because Elliot knows in his mind knows full well that everything was going on. So, eventually, if I had mentioned it, we have a tour. Elliot, like, everybody's starting to lose their minds, and everybody's starting to anarchy in the street, dressing up as F Society, and Elliot is really, really realizing more that they have really won the day of this whole thing. And so Darlene is kind of telling Elliot that's like, hey, we should really get onto this. We should really push this even more, and this and that. We should really get to doing much more portions of this, like, go even further. And And Elliot's just like, well, I think we've kind of already won, to the point where he is going out in the streets with all these other S Society people. And then Mr. Robot is kind of relishing on how basically he's won, like doing this whole entire like speech about how on how we as a people have kind of just limped on for the longest time, because reasonably there had been so many problems, so many missteps and stuff like that. Now we've kind of really like bottlenecked this whole thing to just like this is now our new world, this is now our new order, and all this like big grandiose like speech. And so eventually we find out that this whole entire group of S Society and Mr. Robot weren't even in this area. We find out that Elliot seems to again just be imagining all of this, to the aspect of Elliot looking around and every single person is all gone. So ultimately, Elliot is bizarrely going and talking to not only Mr. Robot, his father, but then eventually his younger self and his mother, all on this big screen. And I just thought it was so weird that you don't really know like how sane Elliot is. Like, is nothing going on? Is this all a ruse? Is it all in his head? Is he gonna just wake up one day having a drug overdose and die? Like, is that how the show is gonna end? Like, basically, like, how exactly is this all just going to fizzle out at some point? But I think recently with that, I think that's all I want to get into. More than likely, for redoing the ending of this review, more than likely I backed over something, which I do apologize, or there might have been something that I completely missed out about, and I apologize about that as well. More than likely, losing my footing and have to going and backing over again, and justifiably like figuring out my footing. I probably missed out on some things. So yeah, we have it to where ultimately the one thing that I missed out about is we have a corporate guy that otherwise fires some of his coworkers. He eventually goes to his boss, or he goes to his boss's dinner party and sees a woman going to the bathroom, and then eventually he goes to a party, and then eventually ends up with that same boss's wife, is consistently pushing the envelope to go, you know what, I really hate this boss, so I'm going to try to get back at him in the worst way, to the point where eventually he just ends up killing his boss's wife because he wants to get some position. And so he's pretty much doing anything to just destroy everything of his life. But then eventually he confronts Elliot and basically saying, like, you know what? I'm loving how I'm basically just destroying everything. Like, I don't really even care anymore. And so Elliot is kind of very much confronted with this guy that is otherwise like-minded like him, and is looking at like them two are working together, because if it seems that they were to also be working with the Chinese on the other side of the world, they're also going to be working with this guy to kind of like put an end to everything. So yeah, very interesting show, but I think other than that, I think I'm going to go here. There might be some stuff detail-wise that I probably otherwise skipped out on or completely forgot about, so I do apologize. But yeah, it's kind of a very good show to me. So ultimately I might go into season 2, more than likely. This might not probably be trending on YouTube, so more than likely people might not care about my thoughts about it. But, anyways, yeah, I just thought it was kind of interesting, and so I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.